Out of the 50 or so mystery thriller books that I read this year, around 20 of them were new mystery thriller books that were published this year. And today I'm going to be telling you about my personal top 10 favorite new mystery thriller books that were published in 2022. There are still plenty of mystery thriller books that were published in 2022 that I just haven't been able to get around to yet. So if you're not seeing some of your favorites on this list, it's very possible that I just haven't read them yet. So as I'm going through and talking about books or at the end of the video, definitely let me know down in the comments below what your favorite new mystery thriller books were that were published this year. Do you feel like they're books that everyone is loving and that's getting a lot of attention, or have they flown a little more under the radar? I feel like mostly the books that I'm going to be talking about were pretty popular this year. They did not all make it into the Goodreads Choice Awards. In fact, most of these, I think, did not make it into the Goodreads Choice Awards, but they were my personal favorites from some of the new stuff that was published this year. So let's go ahead and jump on in. The first three books that I'm going to tell you about, I will talk about them rather quickly because all three of these books were featured in the latest video that I just published, which is my top 10 best books of 2022. That video covers my favorite 10 books that I read this year. It doesn't matter when they were published, and it features thriller books, horror books, psychological books, and a literary fiction book. So if you want to see my top 10 out of everything I read this year, make sure you go check out that video. This one's going to be dedicated just to mystery and thriller books that were published this year. So out of these three, first up we have The Housemaid by Freida McFadden. I've been talking about this one a lot because it was just so much fun and I love to talk about it. It's a story where you're following this woman who is going to be a housemaid for this family. She will be living with them, taking care of their house chores, taking their kid to and from school, just doing anything that they need done. And it seems like a great gig for her because she has a dark, mysterious past that is holding her back from really being able to re-enter society and have her own place and get a better job. So this is really a good stepping stone for her. But once she moves in with them, things start to get really weird. This one was super fast-paced, super twisty, and a ton of fun. I absolutely loved it. If you like domestic thrillers, I definitely recommend picking it up. Next is The Burning Girls by CJ Tudor, which is a thriller that is set in this quaint little English village. You're following this vicar and their teenage daughter who are moving to this new town because the last vicar just hung himself in the church, so the town needs a replacement, and it turns out there are a lot of other dark and mysterious things going on in this town as well. Jack and Flo are both trying to integrate into this town and move on with their lives and become a part of the community, but there are a lot of things they have to learn about what's really going on in the town. This was my first CJ Tudor and I absolutely loved it, so I ended up reading everything else CJ Tudor has written this year. She's definitely a new favorite author for me, and if you like her stuff, I definitely recommend picking this one up. If you have never read from CJ Tudor before, I think this is personally her best, so I would say start here if you're looking to give her a try. And last out of this batch is The Island by Adrienne McKinty. This is a survival thriller about this family who is going off on this vacation to this island off the coast of Australia. Once they are there, something terrible happens and it puts them in a situation where they are not allowed to leave the island, and they are trying to survive and make their way off the island and get back home. This one had my heart pounding. It was such a fun summer read. The atmosphere in this one is great because it's set in this hot island climate of Australia. So everyone's getting dehydrated and suffering under the sun and trying to stay alive. And it is just a lot of fun if you like stories like that, if you like action-packed thrillers, if you like high stakes and not knowing if your characters are gonna make it out alive, then I would definitely recommend picking this one up. Now we'll go into the remainder of the books, and I'm not gonna go in any particular order, just gonna go in the pile that I have them stacked in here. First up, we have The Prisoner by B.A. Paris. I have read 3 books from B.A. Paris now, and I feel very similarly about everything I read from B.A. Paris. I don't think they're necessarily the most wonderful, unique, groundbreaking thrillers, but I think they're really good if you're just looking for a fun time. If you just want a thriller that you can fly through and not have to think too much about, an audiobook to put on, I really recommend checking out B.A. Paris. And if you want to start with her most recent work, this is the one she published this year, The Prisoner. It just came out a couple months ago and I had a lot of fun with it. The premise of this one is you're following this woman who ends up getting abducted after recently getting married, and it turns out that she feels safer with the people who have abducted her than she did with her husband. You get 2 timelines in this one, before the abduction and during the abduction, and you're trying to understand why the abduction happened, who has abducted her, what is her situation with her husband, why does she not feel safe with him, and piecing together the puzzle of what's going on. Super fast-paced, super intriguing story. Again, not the most groundbreaking, never been done before type of thriller, but a really fun one nonetheless. Next is one that is highly debated. People either either love this one or hate this one, and it kind of shows the style of what I like in my thriller books, where I just want to have a fun time. I'm talking about Reckless Girls by Rachel Hawkins. This is more of a slow burn story where you're following this set of characters, this set of strangers who are coming together to go off to this island. They all have secrets that they're hiding from one another, and then once they get on this island, someone goes missing, someone shows up dead, the stakes are high, and you've got to figure out what's going on. I love a story where characters are just being messy. When you put a group of strangers together and it's just drama filled and full of secrets, and oh my goodness, you're learning things about the characters before they are and what's going to happen when this other character finds out what this character is doing. It's just so juicy. It was just such a fun summer read. I think a lot of people ended up being disappointed with this one because maybe it sounds like it's going to start with them at the island and things are just going to start happening and people are going to start dying, when that's not the case. It's more of a slow burn build to the island, and then once they're there, getting to know each other and things going on, and then at the end things start happening, and then it's like boom, 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 what's going on? So just know this has a slower pace to it, a slower build. It is more psychological or like more dramatic as you're learning what the characters' secrets are, what their backgrounds are, how they all ended up on this island together. I personally love stuff like that, so if you like messy characters like me, then I highly recommend checking this one out. Next up is a book that I didn't give enough credit when I read it because it was getting this moment where it was really popular and people were talking about how wonderful it was, and people were particularly talking about the twist and how surprising it was and amazing, and I just had these really, really high standards for this book. And when I read it, I thought, yeah, it was good, but I don't know, I was just imagining this thing that I was never going to get out of it. But as time passes, as I reflect on this book, it has grown on me and I love it more and more. So I think if I would have just read it without having these crazy expectations for it, I would have had a good time. So if you pick it up, that's what I recommend too. And I'm talking about Insomnia by Sarah Pinborough. This is my second book from Sarah Pinborough. I previously read and loved Behind Her Eyes, so I also had high standards for this because I had a 5-star read from this author before, and it's kind of hard to follow that up, but I did end up thinking this was a really cool crafted thriller. In this story, you're following this woman named Emma who is approaching her 40th birthday, and she is very paranoid about it because when her own mother turned 40, she ended up losing her mind. Emma starts having similar symptoms as she is getting close to her 40th birthday. She is facing a lot of insomnia, hence the title, and she's afraid for what might happen to her and that she may repeat the history that her mother repeated. So through the story, you're trying to understand what the history is with Emma and her mother and what was going on, and then trying to figure out how that's affecting what's going on now and if she is actually in danger. I think the best part about this is the twist. Sarah Pinborough is really good at figuring out a really unique twist in thrillers, but it's such a slow burn to get there that you can't be waiting for the twist the whole time. That's how I think I was because so many people were talking about it that I'm like, oh, what's gonna happen, what's gonna happen? But I didn't fully appreciate the build to that. So just know, again, this is another one that's a slow burn, but it has a great payoff at the end. Next is The New Neighbor by Carter Wilson. This was a random book that I stumbled upon this year, but I had a lot of fun with it, and I feel like I've talked about it a lot in these end of year videos. It just keeps coming up when I'm thinking of good thrillers to recommend, but it was just a really solid mystery thriller that I had a lot of fun with. You're following this guy named Aiden whose wife dies, and on the same day his wife dies, he ends up winning the lottery. They did have 2 children, so he does still have kids to take care of, so he decides to take that money to go buy a nice big house in a nice new town just to try to get them removed from it, to figure out how they're going to move on from this situation and live with their grief. But once they get to this area, once they move into this house, they start receiving these weird notes that someone is watching them, and they get increasingly threatening. So throughout the story, Aiden is trying to figure out who is leaving these notes, are they in danger, and what can he do to stop it. I keep comparing this to that Netflix show, The Watcher, because it is so similar to that, and that was such a popular show. So if you've seen that and you loved it and you're looking for something similar, definitely recommend picking this up. I read this before The Watcher was ever a thing, before I ever knew about it, and I just love that element of paranoia and suspense in trying to figure out like who is this ominous figure who says they're watching you. So far, this is the only thing I've read from Carter Wilson, but it's definitely an author that I will be picking up from again. Next up is Good Rich People by Elijah Jane Brazier. This is the first thing that I've read from this author, so I can't really compare it to her other work, which I haven't heard the best reviews of, but I did have a lot of fun with this one, and it does make me curious to pick up more from her in the future. This just has a really fresh concept to it as a thriller, and it just takes a really dark angle that I really enjoyed. When I read this book, I compared it to Finlay Donovan is Killing It, and I said this book is what I wanted Finlay Donovan is Killing It to be, which I feel like is kind of a weird comparison, but it also kind of makes sense when you read it because it has this dark comedic tone to it, but but it really leans into the dark side of that, which is what I like to see. You're following this wealthy couple in this story who like to play games with less successful people. So they allow people to come live in their guest house down the hill, and then they sort of torment them and try to ruin their lives. But the latest person who has come to move into their guest house is going to be a more difficult case to target. She has actually deceived her way into this position, and she is going to put a fight back. So this becomes sort of a cat and mouse game, I would say, between mainly the two women as they're playing these games with one another. It becomes chaotic. You don't know who's gonna make it out alive. It was such a fun time, and it just feels so different from a lot of the other thrillers I read this year. So if you're looking for something a little bit fresh, a little bit fun, I definitely recommend picking this one up. Next up is Runtime by Catherine Ryan Howard. This is the second book I've read from Catherine Ryan Howard, and I have loved both of them. The other one I read was 56 Days, which was one of my favorite thrillers of last year, and this one made it onto my list of my favorite thrillers of this year. This one is super meta, and so it sounds really confusing to explain, but I promise if you read it, you'll be able to follow along. I really like the description that is on Goodreads. I feel like it makes it make more sense, so I'm gonna read that for you. So there is a project that is being made, Final Draft, a psychological horror movie. The tagline of the movie is based on a terrifying true story that hasn't happened yet. It's set at the location of a cottage deep in a forest, miles from anywhere in the wintry wilds of West Cork. The lead actress is former soap star Adele Rafferty, who has stepped in to replace the original actress at the very last minute. She can't help but hope that this will be her big break. And then there is the problem. Something isn't quite right on the set of Final Draft. Adele is about to discover that the real horror lies off the page. What ends up happening in this story is this actress, Adele, who's coming in at the last minute to act in this horror film that is out in this isolated setting in the middle of the woods, is creating this movie called Final Draft. And part of the movie is you're following a couple who's going out to a cabin in this isolated area, and then the woman ends up finding a book in the cabin that is called Final Draft. And that is a story about a couple who is going to an isolated area, and then bad things start to happen. And in the movie, the bad things in the book that are happening that she's reading, those bad things start happening to her in the movie, but also in real life, Adele acting in this movie, the things that she is reading start happening in real life, and she gets isolated at this area, and there's all these creepy layers of things that are going on, and you don't know why or how it's all connected, but it's such a fun puzzle to try to piece together. I know it sounds very confusing, but again, I promise it's so much easier to follow along with than when you're actually reading it. I just think this was such a creative mystery thriller, and I love all the different meta layers of it. I love the horror elements of it as well, because it does sort of have a horror feel to it with this isolated setting and the things that are going on. There's also a level of social commentary in here too about women in the industry that I think was a great add to the story as well. And I think she just might be a new favorite author for me. I'm super excited to see what she does next. And lastly, I have The Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James. Simone St. James is just so good at just creating a really solid mystery thriller. I always say they're not my absolute standout favorite. Like if you tell me to pick my absolute top 3, this didn't make it into the top 3, but it does make it into the top 10. It's a pretty solid story. Like a lot of other Simone St. James story, this has a dual timeline in it. You are following in the present day a true crime blogger who is interviewing this woman who was a suspect of a lot of murders in this small town a long time ago. Back in 1977 in this small town in Oregon, this woman was accused of what they called the lady killer murders, but with a lack of evidence, she ended up being acquitted for the crimes, and she's kind of been living in solitude, and she's been very secretive. But this true crime blogger gets the opportunity to talk to her and get her story out, and so you're seeing both timelines as she's learning the story now and getting flashbacks to what happened in the past to try to figure out if this woman really was a killer, and if so, why. This book has great atmosphere if you're looking for a spooky mystery thriller to read. It is a perfect read for like a rainy weekend. If you just want to cozy up with a book, this is definitely one that I would recommend. And I just think you can't go wrong with a Simone St. James. So that is it for my top 10 favorite mystery and thriller books that were published in 2022. Let me know if I convinced you to pick up any of these. Let me know if you've already read them and what you think. And let me know what were your favorite new published mystery thriller books from this year. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video. Bye!